Welcome to Starkey Soundbites. I'm Dave Fabry, Starkey's Chief Hearing Health Officer and host of the program. If you're familiar with Starkey, you know that Bill and Tani Austin have made a career out of finding like-minded individuals to go around the world and engage in philanthropic events. And one of those is my guest today, whom I had the distinct pleasure of meeting first in 2012. Barbara Bush, Jr., as I like to call you, given that I did have the distinct pleasure to know your grandmother. When I was at Mayo Clinic,
of course,
she was on the board.
Yes.
And I tested her hearing and actually had a couple meetings with her during that time. And we'll get to this later, but what an impressive family you come from. I did have the opportunity in 2012 to interview your father at the Starkey Hearing Innovation Expo. And one of them, a career highlight, of course, to interview a former president, the 43rd president of the United States, but a challenge as an interviewer because I like to say he was like interviewing a river. I knew what the flow was going to be, but then I just teed up questions and let him go.
You weren't quite sure where he was going to go.
And we went and covered a lot of ground, but he had such an ability to make you feel at ease.
Yes.
That at the beginning, I was obviously butterflies in my stomach, and he leaned over. I met him as we were on the stage, and he leaned over and he just said, "We're gonna have fun with this." And he had such a knack for making you feel like we were old friends, even though we had just met. To the point, just as a brief aside, we got into the interview, and like you, a Yale graduate, and was always so self-effacing about the fact that he went to Yale, did exceedingly well, but like to portray himself as just not all that smart. And so we got to one point, and I was talking about his leadership style, and said, what? And he said, you hire good people and let them go to work. And I said, what's the risk of that leadership style? And he said, well, you can't hire sycophants. And I said, ooh, that's a mighty big word, Mr. President. And I thought, I looked at him and I thought, oh my gosh, I just said that to a former president of the United States. And he goes, yeah, you want me to define it for you? And I said, I'll look it up later. But your family is just incredible. And
I'm very lucky.
That's really where I want to begin is, what was it like? You were, I believe you and your sister Jenna were 7 when your grandfather was elected president.
We were, yes.
And then you were in and around the White House when your dad was elected in 2020. So you were 20 years, or not, you were 20 years old when he was elected in 2000. And so you were in and around the White House during your formative years and adult years. What was that like?
Well, it was remarkable in so many ways. I am incredibly lucky. I was very close with my grandparents, all 4 of my grandparents, my mom's parents too, and then I'm very close with my parents. And so we were always with them. When I was little, my grandfather is one of the most humble people I've ever met. I mean, I'll probably cry. This could be a therapy session. And I thought everyone's grandfather was president because he was so humble. I thought in the United States, we just love grandfathers and they all get inaugurations. And so when I went to his inauguration, my sister and I, we were 7. We took off school from 1st grade and it was incredible. I mean, at any age, it's incredible and it's magical, but when you're 7, there's parades, there's balloons, and we left and I thought, this is awesome. I'm about to go to all my friends' grandfathers' inaugurations. And I went back to school and I talked to my best friend, Catherine Oliver, and I asked her when her grandfather's inauguration was. And that's when I realized that
this was a highly unusual thing.
And I went home and I journaled about it because I was so shocked by that. But it really speaks to who my grandfather was in that he was incredibly humble, so humble and was so active in all of his grandchildren's lives that we didn't realize the huge role that he was playing and the huge responsibility that he had. We thought we were the most important thing all of my cousins and I, we still get in arguments about who was his favorite because we each thought we were his favorite, but it just speaks to how he showed up as a human to those he loved and how he showed up as a leader and that he was very humble and gentle and beautiful in that way. And then of course, to get to go back to the White House in a totally different life stage. I was a freshman in college when my dad became president. Which is sort of an awkward time for your dad to become president. But an incredible opportunity in a different way, and that my parents let us know that we could travel with them as long as we took care of school responsibility. And then when we were working our jobs, we could travel with them. And so I got to travel across our country with them. I got to travel around the world with them. I went to 5 continents with them. And just the people that my parents were meeting are everyday citizens that are doing incredibly thoughtful, creative, brilliant things to serve their community members. And so when you're 18 on in that phase of your life, when you're wondering who you're going to be and how you're going to be in the world, to meet with so many different people who were using what they loved and what they were great at to serve others was just an incredible opportunity that certainly shaped my life till now.
Yeah, what an amazing opportunity, as you said, to sort of think that everyone's grandpa is having an inauguration, and then to have your dad then be in while you're in college, as you said. This interview will be about intersections, I think, and the intersection between your work and Bill and Tani Austin with the foundation. But one more little tidbit was I was living in Washington, D.C. when your grandfather was elected, and I was at that inauguration.
Oh, really? Wow.
It was outside.
Yeah,
and
of course.
It was cold.
It was freezing.
It was really cold.
Yeah.
And so I remember that clear as a bell, because we were outside, not up where you were, but standing outside, and living there and being a part of an inauguration felt really special too.
Yes.
Not quite as special as yours.
It's magical regardless.
Yeah. And then you mentioned your college years, and you and Jenna, twins.
Yes.
That we did talk. I'm a girl dad. I have a daughter, Lauren, and now a granddaughter, Charlotte, who we call Charlie. And we did talk about parenting and how impressed I was at how he had raised 2 such well-adjusted adults at that time. And I said, what was his secret for somebody that my daughter was still a little bit younger at that time? But he said, you love them unconditionally, but at times he said, stop trying to make it so hard.
Yeah, exactly.
and looking at your career path, let's transition to that a little bit, because I did, as I mentioned, have the privilege to meet you in 2012, and a couple things happened. So in January of that year, your dad was at our first Hearing Innovation Expo, and I got to interview him. And then later that year, Coney 2012, that video went viral.
Yes.
When viral was just being a thing. It went 100 million
learning
views.
What viral
we were learning
was,
what that was. And I wasn't slated to go with the foundation to Uganda. But at the last minute, that video scared some of our benefactors. Usually one of the things that's great about our foundation is people not only want to give their money, but they want to give their time and be involved. But they were a little worried that Joseph Kony was running around Gulu in Uganda, where we were, and he was a long ways away from there. But one of the more interesting things was you brought, in addition to yourself, you brought team members from the Global Health Corps, which you had co-founded in 2009.
Yes.
And so you brought these energetic young people who were being assigned at hospitals primarily, and really learning about administration and healthcare in Africa.
Yes.
And we just had some fascinating discussions during our time there, and it was such a privilege to meet you and your team and see what brought you to found and co-found the Global Health Corps.
Well, I became incredibly interested in global health through traveling with my parents. I was an architecture major. I really thought I knew what I was going to do with my life. I was going to work in architecture. And in 2003, I was lucky to travel with my parents for the launch of PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is still, to this day, an incredible U.S. policy that provides free drugs for people living with AIDS around the world. And not that many people know about it.
Your dad has done more on the continent of Africa, I think, than any other president to this point.
He's done a lot, for sure.
It's amazing to me.
And PEPFAR was one of his signature policies. And I got to travel with him, and I was a junior in college. So, certainly a time in your life when you're considering what you're going to do. And I took 2 weeks off of my summer job. And I was, in some ways this sounds so naive and cliche, but I was just completely struck. We landed in Uganda, and at the time, PEPFAR was just being launched. So it was going to provide free drugs for people living with AIDS. And we landed in Uganda, and there were thousands of people in the street waiting for drugs. that you or I or anyone in the United States could have gotten. We could have walked to our local pharmacy and gotten antiretroviral drugs, but if you lived on the continent of Africa, they weren't distributed there. And so AIDS in the United States was a chronic illness, and AIDS for anyone living in any country in Africa was a death sentence. And I just couldn't believe that we lived at a time where scientists and remarkable people had created this incredible tool that would save lives, but if you were poor, you didn't get it. Mm-hmm. So I was incredibly struck by that, and also then equally or more so struck by all of the community members and social entrepreneurs and doctors and nurses and family members that we met in Uganda that were trying to change this, and PEPFAR would change this. Flash forward, I'll get the number wrong, but something like 30 million people are alive because of PEPFAR, because they were able to get drugs that had been in existence for a while to take and live a full, normal life. And I just then became pretty obsessed. I was never gonna be a doctor, I was never gonna be a nurse, but I loved thinking about the fact that we had so many tools that already existed to keep people healthy. We just needed to meet them where they were. Yeah. And that was a new, interesting puzzle for me to figure out how I could engage in global health, not as a doctor and not as a nurse. And I ended up starting Global Health Corps with some co-founders, and what we were doing, what we do still, is recruit young leaders from around the world. They're all 30 and under. They join us for a year, and they're placed within healthcare organizations where they serve every single day solving problems. And then throughout our program, they get additional training and mentorship so that this is just the beginning of their career solving issues in global health. And we've gotten to work with thousands of young leaders from around the world. The interest to be a Global Health Corps fellow is remarkable, which is exciting. You know, when you go to bed and you're worried about the world, to know that so many young people want to work in a field that needs more solutions is pretty motivating. And so when I met you, we were with some of our other Global Health Corps fellows that were based in Uganda, working with the Ministry of Health or working with nonprofits doing great work in global health. They joined us.
Oh, it was so the discussions we had, because again, the genesis of this for me, my first time to Africa on the continent, and now I've been countless times to so many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But the Coney 2012 was the event around which that opportunity presented for myself to go there, and my wife too. But the fear was, it was interesting because we had conversations from the Western perspective, which I would say the Coney 2012 video was very much from a Western perspective. Then there were the Africans who were native to the continent and had always lived on the continent. And then the other term, which was new to me at the time, was Afropolitan, where it was native Africans educated in Europe or in the US or South Africa or Australia, somewhere else, and then returned home. And the perspectives of those three, the Western one was this fear of Joseph Kony and the child warriors, which was atrocious, but they weren't in the area where we were. The Africans were saying we can do it ourselves. The Afropolitans had a little bit more of a diplomatic view of saying we can use the assistance, but we really need meaningful partnerships.
Yes.
And that's where I think the synergy between the Global Health Corps and the vision that Bill and Tani Austin have had for doing, putting people boots on the ground. I mean, Bill really, so the world may hear, he takes that as a literal challenge for every single person he wants to be able to fit. And Tani is really the architect then behind now our Starkey Hearing Institutes that we have in Zambia.
Yes.
And now we have one in the Philippines, and we have one growing in El Salvador, to really be able to provide an infrastructure for care and a community-based approach that is built from ground up, with then being able to provide not only in our case, the hearing aids, but the infrastructure to take care of those needs, much in the same way that you're putting those young, energetic students and trying to develop that structure for healthcare within those underserved communities.
Absolutely.
The one thing I'll say, I mean, we have a lot of people that have come and assisted us, and it's been remarkable, and a lot of celebrities like yourself. And but you came in, and the thing that I saw right from the start was you rolled up your sleeves and you were working side by side with Bill and Tani until the last patient was done. And it was hot when we were in Gulu. It was just oppressively hot, and we were outdoors. and then really we were fitting hearing aids by camera light at the end of the day at Sister Rosemary's
yes, of course,
facility.
Yeah.
And your work ethic was what also really impressed me. It just something that wasn't, your passion. The hearing part was new to you. How did that feel when you were working with the kids and the adults?
Well, it's remarkable. I mean, I'll probably tear up, but seeing people hear for the first time or for the first time in years, and obviously it's such a, we, in many cases, I probably take my hearing for granted, and to see someone be able to hear what their mom is saying to them for the first time is, a sob fest in many ways. But I remember being struck by the fact that there would be, I assume, hundreds of people that were, being fit that day. And Bill would not leave until every single person had been seen.
And people heard about us and came.
Yes.
And
no matter how, no matter how late it was, if the sun was gone down and we were outside, as you mentioned, and there wasn't lighting, Bill would be out there till the very end. And I think that is walking the walk. And that's, the type of inspirational leadership that matters is, what people are doing when others aren't watching.
Yeah, it was amazing. But I commend you for how quickly you came up to speed and you were working and motivated and just energized.
Well, it was an incredibly moving experience to be able to be a part of it.
Yeah, I don't know whether you'll remember this or whether you were there that day. I think you were, but you may have been off with the Global Health Corps. But continuing with the CONY 2012 piece, Sister Rosemary, where we were at her school for girls and young women, many of whose families had been impacted by the CONY regime. But Sister Rosemary had an idea for reconciliation, and they brought in prisoners. And it's ironic, the prisoners were wearing yellow, except the prisoners from the CONY group, they were all wearing pink prison uniforms. And she thought that they should come in and we fit them.
Oh, wow. I was not there for that.
I think that was a day that you were off
moving.
doing something. It was incredibly overwhelming that she arranged to have the prisoners come, and many of the girls that were at the school assisted with translation and counseling. And it almost makes me tear up now to think about it, because we got so busy you couldn't think about it during the day, but I would find myself waking up in the night with the emotional response to it, because we didn't have time for the emotional response during the day.
Yeah.
But
that's really beautiful.
That has stuck with me and remains one of my favorite reminders from all of the missions that I've done, was the one that you did with us.
I'm glad I was there with you.
Well, now, first I want to talk about your current role. You're with the NBA, and you've been with them for 2 years as the VP of Social Impact, working on inclusion and equity. Talk a little bit about that role. That's quite a pivot.
It is quite a pivot. My friends think it's very funny that I work for the NBA. I retired my basketball career in 4th grade, so I'm also surprised. But I already had my dream job when I was at Global Health Corps, which I was so lucky in my 20s and early 30s to have my dream job. And I ended up, we have an incredible CEO at Global Health Corps who came in after me. And when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next, I kept noticing during COVID, the NBA was playing in the bubble. And so we used our...
In Orlando, was it the first
we were playing in Orlando, and we used our... At that time, it's almost hard to remember. At the beginning, when you couldn't get tested for COVID, it was so challenging to get tested. Because we weren't playing in our arenas, we could use our arenas as testing centers. They were incredibly... You could social distance in them because they're large arenas, and they're... in each of our markets where we have teams, they're generally very populated cities. And so they were infrastructure that could support in COVID. So we used them as testing centers first, and then we used them as vaccination sites. And then for the election that year, we could use them as voting centers because, again, our games were being played elsewhere. And I just noticed that and thought that was really interesting, that a basketball league whose core business is basketball was using everything they had at their disposal to help people during COVID. And so I ended up, luckily being able to work for the NBA. And our business is basketball. But what's interesting to me in terms of working on social impact issues with the NBA is our reach, everyone's heard of the NBA.
Yeah.
Global Health Corps does incredible work. We go incredibly deep, but we will never be a household name. And many nonprofits will never have the scale that would completely solve the problem. And so it was really interesting to me to go somewhere that has scale and figure out how we can use our reach and our scale to work on issues that impact our fans. And so I've been there for about 2 years, and it's a completely new environment for me, sports and entertainment. It's very fun, and our players and our teams are very committed to the communities in which they play.
Absolutely.
And, we can do a lot with that because the issues that, for instance, exist here are different than those that might be in New York or Dallas, but we can figure out how we can serve our fans and those that live in the communities where we are.
Yeah, and with the popularity of sports, and particularly basketball, just at all-time highs,
yes,
leave it to you to figure a way to leverage that in terms of the impact, as you said, for scalability. Sounds a lot like something Tani would think about, how to leverage the opportunity to scale and sustain it with always thinking about the impact. So that's really cool.
It's fun.
We talked at the onset about your remarkable family. Who would you say, putting you on the spot, in your family has made the greatest impact on you?
Wow. That is an impossible, I'll have to talk about every family member. I feel so lucky in so many ways that I couldn't be luckier to have the family that I have.
Yeah.
And obviously there's what you see externally. I have family members that were deeply committed to public service, so much so that they served in various positions in our government, including president. I would say what has been more meaningful to me is how my family shows up when people aren't watching. I mentioned my grandfather, who is probably the most remarkable person I ever got to know. And now it's interesting being this age, but he really led with love. If someone was hurting, he would cry with them. If something beautiful happened for someone, he would cry with them. His emotions were just right here. And I'm very genetic, for better or for worse. And I just saw a man that was willing to be vulnerable, whoever he was with, and would hurt with you and celebrate with you in equal measure.
And really think from an empathetic perspective.
Yes, he was so empathetic. And that's what I grew up with, a model of a leader as being.
Do you mind sharing the stuffed tiger story?
Oh my gosh, Starkey. I can't believe you know that story. Well, this just shows who he was. My sister and I were my grandfather was running for president, so we must have been in kindergarten. And I do think back on where my parents were at this point. My sister and I were spending the night with my grandfather and my grandmother, but my grandfather had a debate for the presidency the next day.
Right.
Again, where were my parents?
Right.
I don't know. So Jen and I were spending the night with them, and we were going to sleep, and Starkey was my white tiger stuffed animal that I had gotten with my grandfather at this circus. And Starkey went everywhere with me. My grandfather was tucking us into bed. Starkey was nowhere to be found. And I was devastated. So my grandfather, instead of doing debate prep,
For the next day,
it's a mission for him to find Starkey. We had been playing outside, we'd been playing everywhere, so he's outside with the Secret Service, with mag lights, looking for Starkey. And meanwhile, we're 5, we end up falling asleep before Starkey's found, but my grandfather did this search mission, and then the next morning, we opened the curtains, and Starkey was there. We'd been playing house behind the curtains, but...
That's testimony to his character.
The fact that we were staying with them in the first place is really incredible. But that he would drop everything to console his 5-year-old granddaughter. And that's what, to him, mattered in that moment. And that was one story that I imagine all of my family members, we all have our different versions of that story. And so I feel so lucky to have had him. And then my grandmother was hilarious and fierce and authentic in every single way. And showed us with what living authentically who you are was, and that was incredibly meaningful as a girl to see a woman, willing to love fiercely and use her voice and speak her truth all the time was awesome. And then, of course, I have my mom's parents who no one's ever heard of, Jenna and Harold Welch. And my sister and I, people will come up to Jenna and me when we're walking together and they'll say something like, "Oh, it's so nice to see y'all. Y'all are so normal." And we're like, "Thank you," I think. And obviously it's a compliment, but we're like, we wouldn't mind hearing we're exceptional. But it's because we grew up down the street from Jenna and Harold Welch in Midland, Texas, my grandfather was a home builder and my grandmother was a bookkeeper. And they never got to travel like my other grandparents. They learned through reading and through books, and they were our constant in our day-to-day. And we just had great examples of people in our lives every day.
Well, and imagine from your mom as a teacher.
For sure.
And then your mother's parents, and now you and Jenna have co-authored several books,
we have,
children's
yes.
books. What was the catalyst for you deciding that you wanted to write children's books and books?
Well,
You've done both.
We've done both. We started with a book of personal essays, and we'd always kind of talked about doing it. My mom also was a librarian,
right?
So we love reading, and my grandmother loves reading, and so we are big readers in our household. But Jenna and I actually spent the night together the 2016 election. I went over to her apartment. We lived 3 blocks away from each other, and we were watching the results come in, and we were meant to have a meeting the next morning about a children's book. And I ended up spending the night because as it got later and later, the election hadn't been called. And the next morning we woke up together and we went to this meeting that we were gonna have about a children's book. And we realized on the subway there, we've spent every election night together, all that have been meaningful for our country, some that have been more personal for us. And we ended up, from that, deciding to write a book about personal essays called Sisters First, because we've had a partner in everything that we've done since we're twins. And so, that's been another incredibly lucky thing in my life. When you're a twin, you always have a partner. And you always have someone that has your back, and there's no scary days. The first day of school isn't scary because you have someone else's little hand to hold. And so we ended up writing that. And then from then on, we've now written a number of children's books. And I would say it's because most of our favorite memories from being kids are reading snuggled up with my mom and dad or snuggled up with any of my grandparents. And so we love reading individually, but also, and now as a mom, I read to my kids every single night, and it's just a very cozy, warm, safe time.
I love that. Well, and as usual, time is drawing to a close, but two things I want to quickly ask. First of all, when I did interview your dad, as a fellow girl dad, I picked his brain about advice, which I mentioned. But now with you, in transition into parenthood, you have a daughter,
yes,
and then a son,
yes,
and the son is, and my daughter now has. I'm a girl granddad and a girl dad, but she's expecting a boy in a couple months. What advice do you have for me? Because my daughter is worried because I've been a girl dad and now a girl granddad, and she's like, you have to like the new baby as much as you like Charlie. And she's like, I don't know what to do. I've never had a boy.
She's like, oh no, you will love him. I have no advice because I'm in the thick of it and I need all the advice I can get. I have a 3-year-old daughter and a 5-month-old son. But it is the most fun I could possibly have. And I'm so thrilled for your family and for your daughter and for you to have a new little guy to love.
Good grief, yeah. We couldn't, we're over the moon with Charlie, so we can't wait for the new baby to arrive. The last thing I want to talk a little bit about is, hearing loss is what Bill and Tani lead this organization, and Brandon, as our CEO now, has picked up that charge. And we think we're different than everyone else in the industry because we're not only making technology, it's the caring element that really started with Bill, with the foundation, and Tani picking that up, and with the work and the efforts that we've done around the world. But a lot of people think that hearing loss occurs in a vacuum. Now, your grandfather was fitted by Bill Austin. Your dad, I think, probably has some loss, but is still thinking
Sometime
that he's
soon, maybe.
Yeah, maybe not quite ready yet. But your experience from having been on missions and then having a grandparent with hearing loss, maybe other family members who could benefit from amplification. What's been your experience? Did this give you a different perspective on hearing loss and how it connects people together?
Absolutely. I mean, being with Bill and Tani on missions, and I've been lucky to go to Zambia with them and Uganda, and also in the United States be with them. Hearing loss is so isolating, and we know how important connection is, and we know how critical that is to living a full life, but also feeling as if you have others that you can love and be connected with. And so to see people here it truly is a gift. I don't mean to be cliche, but be given the gift of hearing. It not only allows them to interact in the world differently, but it allows them to connect with others. And I know that from my grandfather. When he started experiencing hearing loss, we would have these big family meals, and he wouldn't be able to engage in the same way until he was, fitted and given the tools to hear better. But to see people that are generally connected with others start to have to be withdrawn because they can't communicate and connect in the same way, to know that can be changed and that we can do something about it is remarkable.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful. I don't know how you found time in your schedule to be with us, but I'm grateful for the time
Thanks
and
for
the
having me.
wide-ranging discussion. And I just wish you continued success with your remarkable career and varied career. And thank you for your collaboration that you've had with us in the past. And hopefully we'll get an opportunity somehow between your day job with the NBA, but with continuing. And I know that you have an ongoing interest in the Global Health Corps, but maybe our paths will cross again.
I hope so.
On the continent of Africa or somewhere else around the world.
I hope so. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. And to our viewers, thank you very much for listening today, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Very good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.